العبير، نحن صوت الضمير، نحن قصف الرعود إن يدون كثير. بفجر جديد حنين التراب، بفجر جديد نجيع الفداء، بفجر جديد حنين التراب، بفجر جديد نجيع الفداء. حلمنا أن نكون، وعدنا أن نصون حقنا في أرضنا. نحن نفح العبير، نحن صوت الضمير، نحن قصف الرعود إن يدون كثير.
with us. We know you could've stayed home, just cried and cussed. Mail your guns go off if it's time to bust. Mail they tanks have time to rust. They got the armies turning bullets into gold. They got the hookers turning tricks into cold. And every time the police kicks in the dough, an angel gas breaks dips in the O. And even if a D-boy flips in my O, it ain't enough to buy shit anymore. Sleep in the doorway, piss on the floor. Look in the sky, wait for missiles to show. It's finna blow, cause they got the TV, we got the truth. They own the judges and we got the proof. We got hella people, they got helicopters. They got the bombs and we got the guillotine. We got the guillotine, you better run. We got the guillotine. We got the guillotine, you better run. We got the guillotine. We got the guillotine, you better run. We got the guillotine. We got the guillotine, you better run.
No, it's just on whenever you...
I just spit the dope lines. I don't snort them. Tell the boss to call police to escort them. You don't write out them lines, you just quote them. Get offline, plug into this modem. No, you can't outvote them. The rules are still golden. On the jewels we holdin' if we guardin' our scrotum. If you press the ear to the turf that is stolen, you can hear the sound of limitations exploding. Please, sir, may we have another portion with children of the beast that dodge the abortion. Neck plate firm between the floor and the portion. When shut your shit down, don't call it extortion. Caution, we're coming for your head. So call the feds and get files to shred. Every textbook read said bring you the bread. But guess what, we got you instead. We got the guillotine. We got the guillotine, you better run. We got the guillotine. We got the guillotine, you better run. We got the guillotine. We got the guillotine, you better run. We got the guillotine. We got the guillotine.
Ready whenever you are.
Okay.
Slap 'em up and shake 'em up and then you know. Let 'em off the float and bait 'em with the dough. You can do it funk or do it disco. Yeah, this go. 5 million ways to kill a CEO. Slap 'em up and shake 'em up and then you know. Let 'em off the float and bait 'em with the dough. You can do it funk or do it disco. Yeah, this go. Justified it was worth your waiting. On the turf debating how to get it percolate. You working you while we happy just to work a day. But I'ma slap 'em till my blood starts circulating. Do your checks have elasticity? Did they cut off your electricity? Did you scream and yell explicitly? Force the boss into complicity. I'm a white chalk stencil.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Judson Memorial Church. We just have a couple of announcements before we get started on tonight's discussion. Please refrain from using any photography or video during the discussion. And in case of emergency, please use the exits located to the right of the stage or behind you to the right or left doors. Enjoy the evening.
We're going to begin our program tonight with a reading from the New York War Crimes. So this publication was founded in November 2023 in response to the New York Times coverage of the genocide in Gaza and the paper's complicity in ongoing state violence in that region and around the world. The publication actually borrows its name from a 1989 project by ACT UP called the New York Crimes. And that, if you guys know that was a mock paper that was made to call out the New York Times, specifically with their role in normalizing mass death during the AIDS crisis. But the New York War Crimes has now published 21 issues that are available for free in print and online. I do ask, we brought about 300 copies of our brand new issue that came out on Friday, so if you haven't gotten a copy, please do before you leave. And the paper is focused on commissioning journalists on the ground in Palestine and Lebanon, an analysis that the New York Times does not see fit to print. This evening, we will be reading you pieces from two Palestinian writers from Gaza that we feature in the paper. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I will be reading a piece from Palestinian poet Mouin Bessesso that we published in the 16th issue for Land Day, March 30th, 2025. It's called, "You Do Not Leave Your Personal Vendetta to History." This is the testimony of a Palestinian poet who endured the American-Israeli siege of the patriotic Beirut, or the Beirut standing steadfast behind its barricades as it still does today. I penned this testimony on the 27th of June, 1982. On the morning of the second day of the ceasefire, I have no idea on which page this testimony will end. For the ceasefire could be shattered at any moment by an Israeli plane and an American decision. And yet, I found within myself the strength and resolve to write this testimony for my friends and comrades, the writers and poets across the Arab world and beyond, to the farthest street imaginable, even those writers and poets whose voices have not reached us due to the comfort of geography or the indifference to the fate of a small capital on the map, a capital that filled its sack with sand and crouched behind it, defending a window that has not yet burned and a wall that has not yet shattered. I also found the courage within myself to write this testimony to warn of the grave danger in the sense of the mental comfort that many writers and poets here and elsewhere fall into, as soon as they sign a telegram protesting the orchestrated genocide of Palestinians and Lebanese patriots, or calling for lifting the siege off Beirut. Those who have remained silent fell under the shadow of the Israeli tank, now shackled by its chains. It drags them along the path of its invasion and genocide. And as for those who have sought refuge in geographic safety, I believe that they have fallen into the trap of self-deception, as neither a writer nor a poet among them can claim that they did not see and did not hear, thus claim that the crime was far from them. The crime is no secret, for Beirut, set ablaze by the American-Israeli machine, is not cloaked in invisibility. In vain, they try to eat their bread without the taint of smoke. But the smoke rises, even from the music they compose for their children. It will rise from the very paper on which they write, for the smoke has stained their hands, and in vain they attempt to wash it off with ink. This testimony is not a military report on the events surrounding the ongoing genocidal Holocaust. I leave the task of writing military reports to the experts. Yet in this testimony, it is impossible to separate between the military, political, and sentimental crimes of the Israeli tank. For the warship and aircraft which bombarded us did so with an American-Israeli decision, a decision of political followed by military elimination. Nor does this testimony fall within the framework of a political decree or a literary statement. Oh, how far removed am I from those two frameworks. Soon, not long from now, will come the one who would draft and announce the political and literary statement. It is only a matter of time. For the literary police hounds and cats of publishing houses, with their most widely distributed poets and writers who fled to where the Israeli tank stood, It's only a matter of time. The carts of publishing houses will come, laden with writers, critics, poets, authors of masters and doctoral theses, and the military experts and writers of military columns in monthly and quarterly magazines, to search in the ruins for suitable rhymes for their poems, of children yet to be buried, heroes for their stories and novels. And the military experts will write extensively, not of the mold of the fighters who fought behind barricades of dirt and stone in Beirut, but of the mold of the bombs and missiles, of the mold of the Israeli pilot in the F-15 or F-16. It's only a matter of time for filmmakers and directors of destruction cinema to arrive in order to turn the pockets of our dead fighters inside out and write the script for the new film. I already know what the camera would capture. A wax doll buried in the rubble, the camera focused on her outstretched arms, her head floating above her outstretched arms, her head floating above the debris. It will be a free set design for the directors, photographers, and spectators who will ogle at this scene. They will stand in solidarity with the wax doll. Indeed, they have already shown their solidarity by purchasing a ticket for such a film. It's only a matter of time before all the harlots who followed the Israeli tank come to form the republic and government of the Israeli tank. And I hope this time never comes. I hope it never comes. You do not leave your personal vendetta to history, your personal vendetta against those who left a child, your daughter, of 10 years, feeling as though you've never given her the geography nor history of Palestine. You left her to search for her map on her own, for her national anthem, for anything that would affirm her belonging to a wax doll, as a prelude to her belonging to a homeland. Thank you.
I'll be reading an excerpt from Gazan journalist Abu Bakr Abid, titled Documenting Genocide at 20 Years Old, which appeared in our 14th issue in December 2024. Western media is responsible for my suffering. Inwardly seething, my days are disconcerting. I am forced to do horrific reporting on the terrifying war crimes perpetrated against my people every day. I persevere only by reminding myself that this is not who I am and that I'll go back to reporting on football very soon. But the events are developing every hour in this besieged strip, and I'm only 21 years old. What I'm doing is not journalism. This is genocide documentation, a genocide against me and my people. Journalism cannot be journalism amid such hellish circumstances. I am already traumatized and exhausted. Every story I must tell, every tragedy I must report, and every agony I must convey only adds trauma to every type and shape to my suffering. My documentation of Israel's crimes had led me to many experiences with the Western press, and I have been appalled to get to know their real principles and values. From November 24th to March 1st, I was a regular contributor to the BBC. But as their complicity in the genocide against me and my people became clear, I refused to continue my work there. I confronted many of the BBC's own journalists about the complicity of their corporation in this war. One of them even confirmed to me that their bosses pressure them and threaten them with punishment if they speak in support of Palestine. Although many of them admitted to the BBC's bias, they still asked me, stone-faced, if I would appear on their television program. As my colleagues and I continue to report from the ground, we have been ignored by the mainstream Western press. Even sports media that I have consumed for so long has remained silent, as more than 530 athletes in Gaza have been killed and more than 64 sports facilities have been destroyed. This is a symptom of their racism and supremacy. For them, only Western lives matter. Lately, I've seen Israelis themselves admitting that their army is committing a genocide in Gaza. Still, Western media and politicians continue to deny it. I will not forget that this is who have given consent for the continuation of this genocide. In the end, I still have hope that this war will end and that I will become the human I've always wanted to be, that I will become the football reporter I've always dreamed of. that I will one day change the structure of sports media and awaken the consciousness of people, especially those journalists who have fallen and continue to fall victim to the West's so-called humanity and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that beautiful, powerful reading. It's really, really amazing to be here with you all in this sacred space where our communities and movements have been gathering for generations. My name is Morgan Bassicus, and thank you. I'm not going to be making this night about me. Okay, a few of you have asked. And it's not going to happen. Okay. No. Okay, so just really, really grateful that we get to be in this room of people who refuse to be silent and refuse to be complicit and who understand that all of our struggles are connected. I want to thank the, so thank you for, this event is as, what you may remember, the title of the event is, they're keeping me on my toes, The People versus the New York Times, a cross-movement event. And it's so special that we're getting to visibilize and stage how our movements are all connected tonight. So I want to thank the incredible organizers from the Adela Justice Project, from Black Trans Liberation, from the film Heightened Security, from Jewish Voice for Peace New York City, from Queer Art, from Writers Against the War on Gaza. Let's give them all a round of applause. Thank you so much to the organizers for all of your incredible work, thoughtful, caring, to bring us together, and everyone at Judson for hosting us in every single day and all the ways you do all year long. I just want to take a moment to just thank everyone volunteering on the safety team. Can we give them a huge round of applause? Because as we know, we keep us safe. We have volunteer safety and care team who you can see in orange vests around the room, who are here to support you in case you have any urgent needs. And just to ground us in the fact that what we have is each other, I'm just going to invite you to turn to somebody you don't know and just introduce yourself for a moment. So just turn around to somebody you don't know, introduce yourself. Okay. All right. Good. Get some numbers, form some thruples, open up polyamory, whatever you guys are doing now. Okay, so this event tonight is really the first of its kind. Welcome to all the people who are joining us by live stream. It's a cross-movement event to address the harms that the New York Times has caused to our movements and our communities, including trans folks, Palestinians, black folks, and working people. We have all witnessed in so many different ways how the New York Times coverage and op-eds directly inform, not vaguely, but directly inform, or we're going to learn about it tonight, dangerous legislation, both domestically and manufacture consent for the US-led war and genocide that Israel is waging in Gaza and expanding to the people of Lebanon and Iran throughout the region. So we are very clear and are here tonight to talk about the material effects of the New York Times on our communities and our movements. And if this is your first time learning about this question, welcome, you're in the right place. We're also here to continue to build across movements because we know that all of our struggles are connected, and the way we win is by remembering that we have the same enemy and that we have a joint interest in fighting for each other's liberation. And just to name what we all know is true, which is you probably recognize a lot of people in this room from demonstrations both for Palestinian liberation and trans liberation, because we all make up so much of both those movements, right? So I want to recognize that the power of both trans leadership in the Palestine Solidarity Movement and the leadership of Palestinians in the queer and trans movements. So yes, let's give a hand. Okay, so we're here tonight in the vein of trying to build a movement of movements and to talk about what is the role of the New York Times as part of our opposition. So we have three incredible panelists tonight who I'm going to call up in a moment to read their bios and then invite them to the stage. I'm really excited to learn from them. Going to ask them a few questions, and if we have time, we'd love to hear questions from you all. And then at the end of the night, we're going to get to have a beautiful offering from Queen Jean. And I want to just name, as we always do when we're in here, one of our other amazing trans ancestors, Cecilia Gentili, who is here with us. She's not up there, but she's up there. Is she right there? See, I can't even see. Okay, actually, she's up there. Okay, so Cecilia is such an embodiment to all of us about how the liberation of sex workers and trans people and Palestinians is all connected, one struggle. Okay, so we have three amazing panelists. The first, and I'll read their bios, and then they'll all come up together. Chase Strangio is a trans rights litigator based in New York City. Let's hear it for Chase. In 2024, he became the first openly transgender attorney to argue in front of the Supreme Court. He has worked in and out of the courtroom advocating for queer and trans people for the past 25 years. Next up, we have Mohammed El-Kurd. Let's hear from Mohammed. Mohammed is a writer, poet, journalist, and organizer from Jerusalem, occupied Palestine. He is the nation's first ever Palestine correspondent and editor-at-large at Mondoweiss, and the author of the best-selling book, which you should all get if you don't have it already, Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal, and winner of the Palestine Book Award and the critically acclaimed poetry collection, Rivka. Let's hear it from Mohammed. And finally, really excited to welcome Sabrina Imbler, who is yes, go ahead and give it up for Sabrina, who is a staff writer at the worker-owned site Defector and a former New York Times fellow until 2022. Their first full-length book, How Far the Light Reaches, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Science and Technology. Please join me in welcoming Chase, Mohammed, and Sabrina to the stage. Hi. Is this casual? We're just talking. Thank you all for being here, and really excited to learn from each of you. So want to just create some context for all of us. Will you share from your seat, from what you've read and seen in the New York Times, what are some of the narratives you've seen that the Times has in which the Times has really abandoned their claims to journalistic integrity and directly manufactured consent to harm the communities that you organize and exist within? Do you want to start?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, why not? Hey everyone, what's good? No, I'm fine. I'm good.
Cool.
I'm good. Just thinking of the thought.
Yeah.
I think it's no secret. I mean, I'm here to talk really about Palestine and about the intersection of Palestine with other movements who have been wronged throughout history by the New York Times. And I think it's really no secret that the New York Times has done more than just be complicit in the genocide of Palestinians, but be a partner in crime. And you can see this easily by just taking a look at the headlines, by taking a look at the nut graph, by taking a look at the first few sentences of any New York Times article. It reads like an Israeli military press release, because effectively it is an Israeli military press release. They don't even fact check what they're writing, and they lead with the Israeli voices. We've all seen them bolster fake atrocity propaganda like the widely debunked rape hoax against Hamas fighters, be it, or the 40 beheaded babies hoax, all of these, for lack of a better word, fake news, all this fake news has resulted in the bloodshed of hundreds of thousands of people. The New York Times also famously has, to paraphrase Adam Johnson's new book, the New York Times has brought out the word terrorist out of retirement. Unlike many of its contemporaries, the New York Times still uses it to this day, and they use very visceral language to describe Arabs and Muslims, and of course, Israeli massacres don't get that kind of language. But I will speak very briefly about the irony of all of this. I snuck in the New York Times building one time. My friend let me in who worked there, and she took me, they have a museum like up top, and there is, you know, kind of a room in the museum where I kind of colloquially call as their like mea culpa room, where they say, you know, we were wrong about the Holocaust, we were wrong about Iraq war and the weapons of mass destruction, we were wrong about AIDS. So this is not just about Palestine as we're learning today in this panel, but historically this is a paper that has been so consistently wrong without any consequences, and continues to be to this day. Yeah.
Thank you. Sabrina, you want to go?
Yeah, I can go. Thank you for that. I have also been to that museum, and it's a haunted little space like above a Muji. I guess to offer context for like what I was doing at the New York Times, I am a science reporter who primarily writes about animals, and so like if bugs are doing weird sex or like an eel is found doing something strange, that was my beat. And when I applied to work for the New York Times, I was like, okay, like I also want to pursue this new line of coverage talking about how trans youth face many barriers to accessing healthcare, both gender affirming and regular healthcare, because I thought that the New York Times was doing a pretty bad job covering that area of coverage. And at the time I was naive enough to think it was because of like a lack of perspective. But as soon as I got to the New York Times and started actually reporting on this issue, that is when I realized that their coverage, which I feel like is both obsessive and infantilizing, is actually by design. So the first story I worked on there was a very simple story about a paper that had come out in a journal of medicine that basically found that trans youth face many barriers to transitioning. Like the most obvious paper in the world, I was like, this is gonna be a really easy entry point to talk about this issue. And normally if I were to write a story about a paper, like a single paper in a scientific journal, that story would be read by my editor, a second editor, a copy editor, and then it would just be published. And for this story that I was working on, which featured and centered the story of a young girl named Piper, who at the time was 17 years old, a trans girl, my story was read by my editor, a second editor, a copy editor, an editor from the standards desk, and an editor from the masthead, specifically deputy managing editor Carolyn Ryan. And I remember when this was happening, I was like in the CMS, in the New York Times CMS, seeing all of their initials in my story, which is like 1,500 words. And I was like, how is this a good use of resources for the New York Times, like to have one of their most important editors like in my 1,500 word story about this trans child? And I think that's when I realized that this coverage is very much by design, and it's not sort of the outcome of a bunch of out-of-touch editors being lightly transphobic, but it's like this directive that's coming from the very top of the paper. And you can see, I guess, their bias in all of their coverage of trans people. I feel like the story that I often return to came out in 2023. It was by this writer, Emily Bazelon. It was this big feature in the New York Times Magazine called The Battle for Gender Therapy or something. And I mean, there are so many things that are wrong with this article, one of which is that she used the term patient zero to describe a young child who was transitioning, which of course implies that transness is a disease, is a contagious disease. But I think this article also exemplifies a lot of the more insidious strategies that the New York Times uses, where Emily Bazelon interviewed some trans people for this story, including the historian Jules Gill-Peterson, whose work is incredible and who wrote this book, Histories of the Transgender Child, which basically finds evidence of children's transitioning in the medical system in the US, like across the 20th century. And Emily Bazelon interviewed Jules Gill Peterson, presumably read this book, and then comes to her own independent conclusion that children started transitioning in the Netherlands in the 1980s, which is just like totally refuted by Jules's work. And you might think like, oh, that's so random that this reporter came to her own conclusion, like in opposition to this person who has made it her whole life's work to research this stuff. But I think it's very much that the New York Times, like, they have this story that they want to tell. They're not actually interested in hearing new perspectives, in letting their minds be changed. And then by citing the people that they know they're supposed to be citing, or by interviewing these people that they know they're supposed to be interviewing, but like not actually incorporating their ideas or their scholarship into their stories, it's almost like trans people become like transsexual window dressing or like set dressing to these stories to give this story a veneer of progressive politics, but it's actually just, you know, a story that the New York Times is manufacturing to its own end. And I think the last thing I'll say is that the New York Times is really obsessed with talking about how there's this rise in the number of young people who are identifying as trans, which number one is amazing. We love to see that. And number two is, like, again, the most obvious thing in the world. Like, of course, kids are feeling more comfortable identifying as trans. They see trans people around them, adults and kids. But to the New York Times, I think that they see medical transition as something that is like irrational and disgusting, like a thing that you do of last resort rather than a medical option that should be available to anyone for any reason, which of course, like many of the treatments that you get under gender affirming care are also just given to cis people without any of the gatekeeping that the New York Times or that the medical system makes trans people jump through. And my colleague Lauren Tyson at Defector wrote this great story that basically argues that, like, the New York Times thinks there is this ideal number of trans people in the world, and we're like about to exceed it, which I think is just so true. Like, they are trying to reduce the number of trans people, which is pretty fucked up.
Thank you. Chase.
Thank you both for that, and thank you, Morgan, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation and sort of thinking back to my relationship to the New York Times and how I think about these questions today. I was like, okay, how did I, sort of challenge my thinking around the production of identity through the engagement between law and journalism? Because I think of myself as partly a complicit actor in this as well. As a litigator, as an impact litigator, I'm going to court also telling selective narratives, and those narratives are being reproduced in law. And so I really wanted to think about how am I engaged in exchange as a lawyer who's producing a narrative that has a direct correlation with ultimate legal standards that allocate material benefits and costs to people, and then the media that is also sort of part of this dialectical production that we're engaged in. And as a very junior lawyer, it was very apparent to me that the trans legal subject was as much being produced in the media as in our legal advocacy. And so in my early work in New York, mostly actually in the sort of 2010 to 2012 period, our strategy as lawyers was to never speak to media. It would jeopardize our ability to make change because the way in which the media would cover trans life would then have directly negative outcomes. And we saw it in a very direct way. We would advocate for a change in birth certificate policy, it would be covered by the New York Post, and then it would go away. And so you had this very sort of back and forth relationship. And so for a period of time, I think we spent a lot of time hiding in our advocacy, but still producing harms on our own as lawyers, because that's sort of what we do, try to reduce them also. And then I was all of a sudden at the ACLU, and it's 2015, and the Supreme Court decides Obergefell v. Hodges, and that's the decision that strikes down bans on marriage equality across the country. And there is this immediate sort of question, both culturally and within mainstream LGBT movements and in the media, which is what happens next? And I think I started to tell this story that what happens next is that there's a backlash that's manufactured by the right that positions trans people as a threat. And that is true, that happened. And you can really trace the beginning of the New York Times positing of the trans person as a new type of threat to 2015. And in 2015, the New York Times publishes this op-ed from Eleanor Burkett called "What is a Woman?" And it is the sort of first, I think, contemporary intervention into the New York Times positing trans people as a threat. And you start to see over the next, where are we, 2026, 11 years, this methodical drumbeat of situating transness as threat. And that has a direct correlation to the way in which legislation is introduced, is framed, is pitched, is debated, and then how it is challenged and understood in court. And over time, and I think we'll talk about this more directly, you can really see how you start with this idea that it is the trans person, and particularly the trans woman, who is responsible not just for her own oppression, but for all of patriarchy, which is a shocking thing to say. And yet it was very much put out there in a way that was largely consumed favorably by especially sort of white mainstream liberal feminism. And that then opens the door to this idea that there are too many trans people, that trans people are a threat in the bathroom, that trans people are a threat in sports, and then we start to then move into the healthcare discourse that emerges, especially in 2021. But I would say there's sort of three main things that are happening. One is they use, similar to sort of the language around how they cover Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, as like the most threatening, incendiary language that is completely out of step with even other publications that we would name as being sort of part of producing this type of violence. So you have this language that is very much coding a group of people as threat. Imagery being used in a very particular way. You have trans people always put facing away from the camera, in shadows, dour, we have no spirit. We are, sad. We need to be, managed. And then sort of this both sides narrative that situates trans life as a debate, which then gets transported very readily into the realm of the legal production of, sort of rights and responsibilities, and in the case of the trans subject, is just harm. And so this happens iteratively over the last 11 years, and sort of, I can trace it. The first piece I wrote about is the New York Times collaborating with the anti-trans right was in 2016, the beginning of 2016. So a decade of sort of tracing that precise coverage over the last 10 years.
Thank you three. Thank you all. So continuing on this note of like the material effects of the New York Times's misinformation and propagandist kind of representation of trans people, we're going to watch a clip right now from an amazing film called Heightened Security.
Scrutiny.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Heightened Scrutiny.
I just had to say, because
thank you.
I just want to take responsibility, which I was like, the film has to be called Heightened Scrutiny, and I was really pushing it, but they're like, no, everyone thinks it's Heightened Security, and I was like, but lawyers definitely know it's Heightened Scrutiny, but then I realized that like that's a very small subset of people. So I just want to say I'm sorry.
I want to say I'm sorry. And I want to say I'm sorry. Rupture and repair. Okay,
Yeah.
so heightened scrutiny. Heightened scrutiny. Edit this out of the live stream. Okay, just kidding. Okay, so we're gonna see a short clip from this incredible film called Heightened Scrutiny, everybody, and that follows Chase and other folks who are resisting this movement of anti-trans violence that the New York Times is a central force in. So let's go ahead and roll the clip.
The news media really set the political agenda in many ways. I mean, they establish what the national discourse is. I looked at the front page coverage for 12 months. So the Times, during that 12-month period, actually published more front page articles that framed trans people or the trans movement as a threat to others than they did articles about trans people being threatened by this political movement. More about trans people being a threat than being threatened. That, to me, is just it's shocking.
That coverage changed the material reality wherein at the start of 2021, 0 states banned gender-affirming care for trans adolescents. Now, in 2024, 23 states ban healthcare for trans adolescents. The New York Times and other sort of left-leaning publications insisted upon questioning and questioning tens upon tens of thousands of words of coverage on the legitimacy of our care. In the process of legitimizing those bans, state legislatures cite the New York Times, state attorneys generals cite the New York Times, and judges cite the New York Times. There is a direct link to how our care is discussed in the media, how the laws are passed, how they're defended in court, and how they're upheld in court. I see it every single day.
Oh, this is the other side's brief in this case, opposing the Supreme Court taking the case.
This is to Tennessee's brief to the Supreme Court saying, no, the lower court got it right, don't take this case, don't disturb it. They're citing to the Wall Street Journal in their brief. I've never quoted a newspaper article for some sort of, evidentiary proposition about, medicine or science. I mean, you rely on the experts that you put in, and I've never seen so many references to newspaper articles as I have in the context of litigation over trans healthcare, where so many of them are just quoting from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Atlantic. The coverage of trans people by the center left morphs into far-right policy in just a matter of a few years. Even in a court that should be good for you, there has been just a genuine shift because of the culture and I do believe, I'm like, oh my God, like it was the Title IX order so bad because even like Kagan and Sotomayor and Jackson are reading too much of the New York Times and and I think about this case and they cite the New York Times and so I just could see it.
Yeah, I mean the New York Times to like pipeline from literally from publication to being used in this litigation was like 6 days in one case. Like it was in early February. Another horrific, just absolutely untrue at every turn, easily debunked, but like Pamela Paul op-ed came out, and within less than a week, it was cited literally in Idaho's briefing in this case.
As kids, they thought they were trans. They no longer do, which is by Pamela Paul. And something that I think people don't understand is if you publish something in the New York Times opinion section, it will be fact-checked. Even though it is opinion, it's like a reported opinion, and it will be fact-checked. And I published a story in the New York Times opinion section about this deep-sea amorphous blob that was blue. And it was one of the most rigorous fact-checking experiences of my life. Like, I got into this whole debate with the fact-checker about whether we know more about the surface of Mars than we do, like, the deep sea itself. And it was really fruitful. Like, it's an honor to have your work fact-checked. But this story by Pamela Paul, like, I really don't understand how it could have passed this process of fact-checking.
There are 3 links on the phrase several researchers have documented, which cues the reader to believe that at least 3 researchers have documented what she's talking about. Those 3 links go to Lisa Littman's personal website, a paper by Lisa Littman, and they go to another paper by Lisa Littman's close collaborator, Michael Bailey. And one of the links actually also goes to a study that has subsequently been retracted.
If I were to pitch a story about a paper that was published in a journal like that doesn't have peer review, they wouldn't allow me to cover it because it's like not real science, and yet that passes muster as evidence in this op-ed.
This is exactly what we're talking about. Whenever we say that the centrist sort of both sides journalistic media is laundering disinformation, this is a prime example of it. A filing was done by the people that were representing Idaho. The state of Idaho had passed a gender-affirming care ban, and in that filing, they referenced the Pamela Paul article and just like cited a full half page of it. They threw verbatim into the piece.
So we're talking about the narrative production of trans life being used to criminalize trans life. And it's not a long line from point A to point B.
Can we also just thank Chase and Sabrina for tolerating the truly nightmarish experience of having oneself projected behind oneself. So thank you for tolerating
If you were
that.
like, Chase, what is your nightmare? I'd
This
be
is
like
it? Okay.
sitting on stage, listening to my voice with my head huge
100%.
behind my head.
100%. So we're going to debrief that after. But now we're just going to move right on through it. So thank you for tolerating that. Mohammed, I'm curious, like, if you know, given what you talked about the museum of, like, these are shared tactics across issues, across movements that the New York Times is complicit in repressing. I'm curious, like, if you see echoes of these same tactics, or how you see echoes of these same tactics of misinformation, being part of criminalizing the Palestine movement and manufacturing consent for genocide.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the factor or the kind of the genesis of all of this is that we must understand journalism as something editorial. There is an assumption, or the way we learn about journalism growing up and the way people speak about journalists is that the assumption is that journalists are people who are in pursuit of the truth, or that journalism is something that is meant to be objective. And we see time and time again that journalism is not that. It's a matter of framing a story to invoke a certain reaction. Even if I'm just taking a photo of this audience right now, the sentence I write underneath that photo will change the way the reader interprets that issue. So these things that are mentioned in the documentary are certainly not surprising. They fall in line with the same tactics of fear-mongering and editorializing and propagandizing that we've seen in Palestine, what we've seen in Iraq, that we've seen during the AIDS crisis. And also our impulse, which I think is the rightful impulse, is to constantly try to correct this false information. So we see it time and time again on Twitter, people using a New York Times headline and then redlining it with a marker and saying, fixed it for you. These impulses are important and necessary. But I think beyond, you know, critiquing these institutions, beyond really liquidating the New York Times and turning it into a Burger King, we need to support our own media outlets and our media institutions. I'm not saying build, because there are so many that exist. I'm sure in the case of the trans struggle, there are so many. In the case of Palestine, I can count 10. I don't want to, because it's free press. No, but there's so many. There's Mondo Weiss, Electronic Intifada, Drop Site, Middle East Monitor, WAWAG, anyway. But beyond kind of criticizing these places, we need to support our own media organizations, and also the tendency to constantly correct false headlines highlights really a catastrophic lack of critical thinking. The issue is that these people who have so much power, so much influence, so much readership, can do this harm they do is in part due to the fact that we cannot trust the average reader to think about the lines they're reading, about the headlines, about who are these lines in service of, who are these institutions meant to serve. Is it elite interests? The short answer is yes, but sometimes it's even more entangled with the interests of dominant powers. I mean, when we're talking about the New York Times in the case of Palestine and the genocide of Gaza, we're not just talking about editorial standards that are murky or racist or anti-Palestinians that are, you know, rabidly pro-genocidal. We are talking about an institution that is built up of individuals who have direct ties to the Israeli military, who have sons and daughters who serve in the Israeli military, who themselves have served in the Israeli military, who have ties to Israeli think tanks and Zionist think tanks, of reporters who live on stolen Palestinian homes in Jerusalem. So it's the connection is cartoonish and flagrant, but it should persuade us to make a public reckoning, because oftentimes, sorry, this is the last thing I'll say, but oftentimes when these headlines emerge, be it about trans people or Palestinians or whatnot, we find ourselves in kind of a performance of sort, proving our humanity, proving that these libels and diatribes printed against us are false. And so we put ourselves in a corner, we allow ourselves to be forced into cross-examination to prove to the average reader that no, I'm not gonna do this to you in the bathroom, or no, I'm not gonna hijack your plane, I can't fly a plane. And instead of this, which is ultimately a distraction and a waste of time, we should be spending our resources, our attention on our coalitions, on our movements, instead of trying to rehabilitate institutions that are so profoundly rotten. We'll talk about the rotten part later, but yeah.
Thank you. And before we turn towards the question of resistance and the question of trying to hold the New York Times accountable and build and support alternative institutions that are actually not a part of deeply complicit in the forms of violence our communities are experiencing, I wonder if there's anything else you two want to add about the material impacts of the New York Times' coverage as part of this dismantlement and attack on trans care, trans lives, trans young people. Anything else you want to make sure we know about this material connection, how this coverage results in laws that actually terrorize trans people's lives?
I mean, I think that it just couldn't be more stark. It's shockingly stark in terms of how readily the way in which trans life has been constructed in the pages of the New York Times has fueled what we've seen legislatively and then in the courts. And similar to the sort of preposterous notion that journalism is objective, I think similarly there's this idea that law is that you're just applying some neutral principles. I mean, that idea, obviously, I doubt anyone in this room subscribes to it, but it is the dominant notion, and so I think that the way in which we've had this mutual reinforcing notion of objectivity sort of distribute these harms over time has been really catastrophic, and I think I just haven't been able to get the New York Times framing out of the legislative construction, out of the courts, and we've tried, and it's just too much. It's too powerful, and then it's not just how the laws themselves are written and then codified statutorily and in legal opinions. It's also the case that this coverage frames how trans people, trans families see their own safety. And so one thing we've seen over time as this coverage has progressed is people can't, safely go to the doctor. People aren't able to be plaintiffs in litigation because they have a sense that they have to make their lives smaller, and there's a direct correlation to that. So it's not even the structural, it's not just this structural production of harm, it's also sort of having these micro changes in how people are conceptualizing themselves and their willingness to navigate publicly in the world.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say briefly, I feel like the outcome of all of this is that the New York Times is just fundamentally lying about reality. I think if you were an alien who had never set foot in the United States, but you read the New York Times every day, which is I don't know that alien's deal, but you would think that it was possible for a child to be walking down the sidewalk and to slip on a banana peel and through a series of unfortunate events wind up getting top surgery and regretting it. And it's so wild to know that that is the narrative that they are pushing. And I think what's very insidious about it is the New York Times, when they talk about trans youth, they frame it through this language of protection. We want to protect these children from potential regret. We want to look out for them. But of course, they are not actually protecting children by adding another layer of gatekeeping to the labyrinth of gatekeeping that already exists for trans care. They are just causing more material harm and violence to these children. And just something I wanted to I wanted to bounce off of the idea of objectivity is I feel like the New York Times within the institution, they will often, the way that they apply the slur of activist has a huge double standard, where any trans person who is trying to cover a trans issue, like, they will be accused of being an activist. A lot of the critique that I got from the masthead was that my stories, because they argued that trans kids should have medical autonomy, had an activist slant. And then, of course, if we think about someone like Bari Weiss, who, classic woman, like, who famously worked for the New York Times and sort of was trying to get fired to make a statement, but then, like, no one would fire her, so she'd, like, quit on her own. Like, she, in I feel like 2012, said openly that what brought her to journalism was advocacy. And when she says advocacy, she means her years at Columbia spent trying to get Arab and Muslim professors who were outspoken against Israel fired. That was her advocacy. And she said that she sees, like, her role in journalism as the connection between Zionism and movement journalism, which is wild. And of course, like, when she was at the New York Times, was anyone saying, like, Bari Weiss is an activist? Like, no, they were calling trans people activists. They were calling black reporters activists. So it's just a huge double standard.
T, T. Okay, so, did you do something you were about to say? Or no, did I misread your face? That was...
I was just really intently listening.
Projection, okay. So, Mohammed, you began us talking about, and all three of you have been talking about strategies for resistance and knowing who we're up against. And not just misunderstanding the New York Times' problem as just a question of coverage, but as a deep entanglement into institutions, the war machine itself. So I wonder if the three of you can talk about strategies for resistance, for resisting the New York Times' role in suppressing our communities and criminalizing our communities, and also, like, what we're up against, like, both what strategies you all are engaged in to resist, and also what help us get real about the power that we're up against. And ACT UP, in addition to giving us the name the New York Crimes, ACT UP also taught us that we don't speak to the media, we speak through the media. And so I just wonder, like, and they also were really intent on saying diversity of tactics. So I don't think there's any one way in which we're not looking for uniformity amongst the three of you of one analysis or one way to resist the New York Times or one way, but want to surface as many as possible. So, yeah. Mohammed, can we start with you about like your organizing regarding the New York Times?
Yeah. Sure, why not? My organizing. So I think, like you said, there's a diversity of tactics. I've been going on television to talk about no one invites me anymore. But I used to go on television to talk about Palestine for a few years now, since 2020. And most of the time, the tactic has been, like you said, we speak through the media. You do the pre-interview, you tell them what they want to hear in the pre-interview, and then you go on live television and you say whatever you want to say, and then you never get invited again. And I think that is a model that needs to be kind of embodied in the way we speak to the New York Times and other outlets, because I think for many people, they view being asked for their experience or expertise as a badge of honor. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But I want you to think, if you're asked to speak to one of these corporate media organizations, I want you to think that you are deigning to speak to them, that you are, like, going in spite of yourself and your self-respect to speak to them, and you're speaking to them in the most, concise, short way that they cannot mutilate and manipulate later in the edit. I was volunteering with Writers Against the War on Gaza in their campaign for boycotting the New York Times opinion section, which is, we got over 1,000 writers, many of them were past contributors to the New York Times, to refuse their labor, to refuse offering any of their labor to the New York Times opinion section specifically. Applause. It was really it was a hard campaign to pull off that we are still pulling off, and we encourage everybody, if you know any writers, to encourage them to kind of make the pledge to not contribute to the New York Times, but also for yourself to unsubscribe from the magazine. I hope you all have done so. But anyway, I want to say that you think the hardest thing about the campaign was, finding statistics or creating a solid case that this is a genocidal rag. But in fact, the hardest thing about the campaign was the confrontation that maybe the New York Times' most lethal force and most lethal weapon isn't the money or the billions or the building or the networks or the connections. It's the prestige. It's the prestige and the fact that people are intoxicated by prestige. People think, many of us, we're underprivileged, under-resourced, we are born into a certain class or a certain geography, and we think, we don't have the privilege, but I can acquire the prestige. And we think that we are, getting a seat on the table, and we told ourselves just a few more months until I have more, of a say in the meeting room, and then I can push them, and then it's decades and decades, and then you look in the mirror and you no longer resemble yourself because you are, good line, right? I wrote it down before. Damn. Lost it. No, yeah. I got it. Anyway, but I think this is not, by any means, this is not like an original thought. George Jackson has talked about prestige a whole lot, and many leaders have told us about prestige. But it's something that's not quantifiable, and that you really do not know how to undermine. But in our conversations with many writers, trying to get them to say no to writing to the New York Times, we tried to drill it in them that the currency is that they are the currency by which the New York Times creates its prestige, not the other way around. Your experiences, your expertise, these things that populate the paper is what gives the paper its glory today. And if we walk away from it, then it would be a shell. It wouldn't be anything. Of course, I don't think we should stop talking to the media altogether. I think it's important to to talk through the pundit and add the person sitting on their couch and have a repeatable, simple propaganda line that will be drilled into the viewer. These things are important, but it's also important to draw a line in the sand and to say no to certain things, and to stick with the group. Sometimes I think the refusal to participate in political campaigns or boycotts, be it 2 days ago they launched a boycott of 92 Street Y, famous venue apparently. Sometimes people refuse to participate in these boycotts, and the rationale, if you scratch below the surface, oftentimes is arrogance. People think that, I am going to continue to talk to this organization that has said to all of my peers, that has said to all of my people, to all of the people of my race, you're not good enough to be here, but chooses me individually to come into its halls. And I'm going to convince them. And people think, I've said this before, but people think that they're going to write an op-ed in the New York Times and Chuck Schumer is going to read it and start supporting Hamas. That's not going to happen.
I don't mean to, sorry, will you also share, Mohammed, about the 3 demands of the New York Times boycott campaign? Because I think those demands are so smart and really ground it in here's what you all are.
The 3 demands.
Someone who signed it, yeah.
Yes.
The 3 demands to retract.
I helped draft.
That's right. The 3 demands to retract Screams Without Words.
Yep.
The piece that you talked about, the vastly debunked, completely propagandist allegations of sexual violence, of serial sexual violence. That's one demand. The second demand was for a thorough review of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim bias within the New York Times, and also to call for an arms embargo.
Yep.
Yeah. So
these are the 3 demands that I remembered.
Okay, you too. So what strategies are you engaged in? What are you seeing about how to intervene?
I guess just to piggyback, that is the word I was looking for earlier. I think this event is called The People versus the New York Times, but it could also be like The People versus The Atlantic, famously a magazine that's run by an editor-in-chief who served in the IDF. Like, this ideology is rampant throughout prestige media, but I think something particular about the New York Times is, like, if you think about sort of the blighted media landscape as like the Arctic, the New York Times is like the last big glacier that like hasn't melted yet. And so as everything else is melting and all these people are going like Jack and Rose mode on doors, like the New York Times is there to hire those people and just amass its power. And it's like one of the last huge stable institution that's able to cover international and national news, that's able to do big investigations. And so people rely on the paper for those things. But then, of course, you know, as Mohammed was saying, like writers who don't actually work for the New York Times but hope to one day, like they're afraid to speak out against them. They fear that that will sort of get them, screwed over by like one of the last staple jobs in media. And people who do work for the New York Times are under this draconian social media policy that prohibits them from speaking out against the paper or their colleagues. So I think it is crucial to be subscribing to alternative news sources, to be reading and writing criticism of the New York Times, publishing it. I think I'm seeing a lot of like younger people in this audience. Like, talk to the people in your life, your parents who read the New York Times, send them criticism of the New York Times, like have these conversations with them so that they understand that this paper that they presume to be objective, that there's no such thing as objectivity. And I would also say, like, if anyone is playing Wordle, like, don't play Wordle, like, don't play Spelling Bee, like, there are other games. The New York Times is so profitable because it's not just a newspaper, because it has cooking, because it has games, because it has Wirecutter. And if you support those things, you're also supporting the New York Times.
What are the other games? That's a question for later.
Analog puzzles.
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 Okay, great. Chase.
Yeah, I mean, so I've just been really reflecting on this during the panel. I mean, I guess I'm slightly differently situated in the sense that I'm not in any way in journalism. I don't sort of think of my sort of community as being among journalists. I think of myself as a lawyer, and a lawyer is a compromised actor in systems of power. And so I feel a little more complicated sort of saying this is my referendum on an institution, a set of institutions, because I myself am part of that too. And just want to acknowledge that. And then just with candor, you know, sort of as I'm looking at my 10 years of sort of publicly criticizing the New York Times and continue to and try to think about ways that we can really destabilize these constructs and this reliance. They also come for people individually. And my life has been dramatically changed in the last few years just by the reaction to my existence, and I just don't like that as a person, and it makes me hesitant. And there is this sort of structural chilling of speech, of engagement that happens when you end up being targeted by sort of the follow-on consequences of things. And some people are really brave, and some people, like, I'm just like not. I just want to be quiet. And so I think there is just, it's important to sort of think about, like, what are the consequences of how we engage? Like, what are the consequences for our clients when they go into court and yet their bodies and lives are not only being surveilled by the legal system as such, but by the media, whether they present themselves to a journalist or not? And sort of, you know, I think we just have to account for all these things. And my strategy is really about community soft care and sort of continuing to be proximate to people, because I personally lose sight of my own subjectivity. I start to see myself through the lens of the stories being told. I wish that I didn't. It's just a product of that repetition of decades of doing it, of being very close to it. And so I think my strategy, in all honesty, is sort of holding space for the impact of it, trying to build people up in ways that feel, sort of embodied and whole, because I see myself having been changed by sort of the experience of being in constant engagement, and then also being part of a different compromise system that is also producing harms. I'm very much inside it. I consider myself akin to someone who's chosen to work at the New York Times, and I will say having comrades inside these institutions has been essential to trying to destabilize the narratives and get information out. In the same way, I would say, like, I rely on people who have clerked at the Supreme Court. I rely on people who are inside of institutions as much as those who are mobilizing outside of them. And so so I would say that's one of my strategies too, is recognizing the compromised role that we play and try to be in service to people who need the access that we have and the information that we have from the inside.
Right. And, yeah. And this notion that as organizers we cherish that everybody has a role to play, no matter where you're situated, no matter what kind of risks you're willing to take. And there's really, we try to push back against the kind of hierarchy of sacrifice, that like only one role is, that's the real thing. It's like, it's the people getting arrested versus the people doing jail support. It's like, no, of course, we're all taking different risks for different reasons, and we want people to take risks that they feel good about, and we want to create an abundance of opportunities for people to plug into movements and feel welcome and feel like there's a role for you no matter who you are, what you're bringing, how you want to contribute, there's a role for you. And I feel like that's our collective responsibility in this room, is to be the door into these struggles for people. Thank you. And that ties to my next question, which is kind of complicated. I don't even know how to say it, which is about the right and how the right, I know exactly, which boo. But what we're seeing with the right and over many years is their ability to co-opt concerns that could be left concerns, such as the propaganda that is the New York Times, such as, Naomi Klein's doppelganger talks about this, right? How we end up seeing these kind of like twisted versions of ourselves, or people's skepticism and criticism of the state, of corporate media, of medical institutions, justified, correct skepticism is co-opted into a right-wing agenda. And we see Trump is also going after the New York Times. Right? He has a $15 billion lawsuit against the New York Times. So how do we, and this is not a question that any of us can solve, but I think it's on all of us, how do we not let our critique of the New York Times, of corporate media, of legacy media, be co-opted and be captured by the right? How do we ensure that when we're welcoming people into our critique, we're bringing them into the left, into a set of commitments about collective liberation, not commitments about anti-Semitic conspiracy theories or xenophobic racism, which the right is so good at. They are really good at welcoming people. And we have to be better than they are. So I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts about this question that is live, I think, for many of us.
No? No one? Okay. So I think this is going to deviate a little bit from the question. That's okay? I'm going to deviate. I think there's a little bit of a flawed premise here. I don't think this is like about. I think what you said about the right is absolutely correct about their ability to co-opt things, and I think there is a brilliance almost, of their ability to be so simplistic, and in that simplicity allow so many people in. And we are our side, we're scholars, we study things, and so we are committed to nuance, but sometimes that nuance, risks getting people lost. But that's another debate. I think historically, we think of undermining the press or launching attacks on the press as, a function of fascist factions of society. You know, you read any fascist playbook, and the first thing is that they attack the press. And so we view the press and journalism in this kind of light of reverence. But I think what this framework neglect, of course it's true that the fascists, or mostly the right wing, or people who are aspiring to power, try to attack the integrity of the press. But I think what this framework lacks is that these attacks on the press are not attacks meant to undermine the truth. They are attacks meant to undermine the dominant powers to which the press is loyal, right? So the groups, you know, Trump is in his like electoral months. This is, you know, when he first had his campaign, he is launching attacks against CBS News, for example, and ABC News, and calling them fake media. But it's not because what they're purporting is falsehoods, but because they are at the time not loyal to the Republican Party or to the Trump Party. But now the right wing has largely hijacked CBS News, right? Barry Weiss is the leader. It was acquired by a Zionist family. So the attacks on the press most of the time are not really meant to be attacks on the truth. And I think this is important because we need to kind of we need to rid the journalism of this air of reference and this like kind of sacred air that I think a good example for this is that we think of journalists the way we think of doctors, but many doctors and many journalists are awful people, you know? And the industry itself, these industries themselves are hugely problematic industries. I mean, I think we all know the statistic that maybe 54% of black women feel discriminated against by their doctors don't believe them. Similarly, you talk to anybody from the global south and they refer to the mainstream media, to the corporate media, as discriminatory and as racist. And when we look at the roots of journalism in this country, it's never been a noble profession. I mean, it's never been a noble profession. There was a point in time where you could place ads for runaway slaves in the paper. You could advertise humans to be sold and bought in the paper, right? The history of these places is like reeks of crimes and immorality. So I say all this to say is that it's not so bad that the press is under attack and that mainstream media is under attack. I don't think it's so bad because, again, we are not attacking journalism as reporting the truth. We are attacking a mob of highly paid elite individuals who editorialize the truth in a way that makes you want to condemn it, you know? So, on the question of like how do you attack or how do you criticize the New York Times without letting it be co-opted by the left, I think it's ultimately kind of a matter of physics. If the New York Times editors are only getting attacks from the right wing, they will inevitably move to the right. They need to be getting attacks from all sides so that they are, you know, on thin ice. And I think this is true not just about the media, this is about the mayor. You know, many people will say you cannot criticize the mayor of New York for certain things he said or done, but they don't understand that if that critique from the left wing gives the mayor or this organization or the New York Times political coverage to move in our direction. Yeah, I'll stop here.
I'll just add quickly that it's like also the job of journalism to critique itself, and until recently the New York Times had a public editor whose job was to critique the New York Times, and then they got rid of that position. But it's like that journalists critiquing journalists, it's like fundamental to the history of journalism.
And I just, yeah, I mean, listening to you, I'm thinking about after the first Trump administration, one of the things that I thought was the most destructive outcomes was the way in which there was this mobilization around the notion that the law will save us. That what came out of it was this idea that we're going to run into court and that's going to be the check on executive action. That's going to be the check on legislative action. And this sort of becomes reified in all these different ways. And so I think I don't know that you can control for how what you do is co-opted, but I think partly what we have to be doing is not, is not just critiquing, but having an alternate vision. And that alternate vision isn't going to align with, sort of broadly conceived the right. And similarly, how I think about, the law. So much of what I hear in the center, left, liberal spaces is, this Trump is a threat to the rule of law. We need to bring back the rule of law. I was like, what? The rule of law? What? That's our demand? It's like when you go to legislative hearings and they're like, talking about trans people in sports, and the feminist position is men are just better, stronger, and faster. I was like, what happened here? And like we got so facile in our thinking, and that has been sort of part of this time that is so alarming. And so I think my answer to that is not to think about how to not be co-opted, but to think about what is the demand that we're making, and what is it that we're building, not just what are we tearing down.
Amazing. Okay, thank you three so much for all this brilliance. So now we're going to open it up to questions from you all. So let's have some lights in the audience. And are there folks going around with mics? No. Okay, great. There's one here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. One thing I was thinking about in the conversation with Palestine and trans coverage in the New York Times was how the New York Times covered migration, especially in New York City. I wrote my thesis a couple years ago on, an analysis of all the headlines and subtitles with how the New York Times covered migration. And it followed a lot of the patterns of what you guys talked about, is what the political project that was reflected in these titles was, framing migrants as a burden to New York City, as in competition with social welfare that working class New Yorkers were trying to access. Again, things that, and arguments that you hear from the right as the predominant representation of how migration is covered in the New York Times. And I guess it makes me think about the topics you guys talked about. And I've sort of thought of this question and have my own thoughts, but I'm curious what your reflections are on what the project of the New York Times is, and what the political project of the New York Times is, and what that says about how it should frame how we think about it.
Should we take a couple questions? Yeah, maybe. Okay, thank you for that beautiful question. Maybe let's take a couple, and then the panelists can answer.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. So I'm a trans student myself who's been impacted by the New York Times' negligence, but I'm also interested in journalism and advocacy. And so my question isn't about so much the tactics of that, but as public figures, how do you protect your safety, and how are you able to disconnect from your stereotypical country, so that you can recharge and be able to do this work?
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Matt. Kind of similarly, building off of some of the ideas of that last question. As you described, those are all the other things I'm not entirely going to say that, but Chase really struck by what you said about you change by constant engagement, and I don't see myself through the story being told. I'm curious of any of our panelists that feel called to share. Is there any engagement with things that make you feel alive or like yourself or like a part of the collective you want to be in?
Awesome. Thank you. So maybe we'll just, whatever these three, this first question of what's the political project of the New York Times in this, what's the political project of the New York Times? I think this is building on your response. Like what, not just these particular two examples, but what's the political project? And then these two questions which seem kind of linked, of like how do you protect your sanity and your spirit and your soul? And where do you go to, what institutions, what platforms are you reading and are you invested in, and where do you go for your analysis and reflection?
Yeah, I guess to answer the second question, I think I don't know. I think the New York Times, like, as an institution, offers these things that seem like it would be really great. You get at least 6 figures you'd get 6 figures, but it's like, I guess there's a big range within 6 figures. You get career stability, you get prestige, you get all these things, and yet if you work there and you have a moral compass, it sort of like, it feels like you're being like parasitized by that sort of zombie fungus that goes into ants. Like it just, you still look at yourself in the mirror and you have the same face, but it's like the inside of you is sort of become rotted. And that is, just to speak for myself, what it felt like to work there, because it's a job that makes you take all these moral compromises. Like, it doesn't allow you to go to protests. And so when I worked there, I couldn't go to the Dyke March. And I was kind of like, do I want to work for somewhere that won't let me go to the fucking Dyke March? Like, that's wild. And I think the most that you can do to protect your soul and nourish it is to work for somewhere where you can be your full self and where you don't have to make those compromises and you don't have to, you know, dilute your politics or dilute what you share of yourself in public. And I think I would also add that it's just great not to be on social media if you don't have to be, because then it gives people less reason to find you.
So I feel sort of embarrassed that I'm not sure I ever really asked myself, like, what do I think the political project of the New York Times is? And I'm not, and maybe that's okay, because I'm like, it doesn't matter to me what it is. It sort of reminds me of sort of how I think of, you know, our Constitution. It's sort of, it has some aspirational ideals, but it's founded on chattel slavery, and we keep coming back to it as an answer to the problems while it is, in fact, structuring and reproducing them. It's sort of like an organizing principle of US capitalism. Obviously, it has it's a global reach. But it is just, but I'll say, similar to the Constitution, I have this some weird codependent relationship with the Constitution and the New York Times, and I'm still working on it. And trying to extricate myself from it and recognize that sometimes there's only so much harm reduction that you can do with the tools that you've chosen. And you just have to continually ask yourself that. And then in the question of sort of then how do you navigate within that, sort of, I'm sort of like a lifer of that. Look in the mirror and ask yourself, you know, how much am I being compromised, and, you know, sort of losing certain things, but feeling like someone needs to be there, and maybe that's wrong, and sort of being in this constant dialogue with oneself. And I think you know, how can you do that and both feel safe with yourself? You know, am I still the person I want to be? Am I holding up the principles that feel essential to me? I think is an everyday conversation that I have with myself and the people that I trust and the people that I care about and the people that I work with who I also trust. And then when it comes to safety, I think I really only have thought about these things more in the last 2 years, when physical threats to safety and other forms of threats have become a regular part of my life and the lives of many people that I am in, you know, community with. And I just don't know the answer. It just feels so, you know, I don't want to stop speaking. I don't want to stop doing, and yet some days I do want to. And that's just the honest answer.
I'll just say it again, that I think the political project of the New York Times has always been in service of elite interests. It's a profit. It's really a glorified gaming company, right? This is where they get most of their revenue. It's from the games and the cooking. I know this from inside sources that most of their revenue comes from gaming, and their editorial side. Sometimes they'll publish like a nice thing about a lost dog or whatever, or like a miso cookie, but most of the time it is and has been consistently, historically, a rag, really, in service of class interest. It fashions itself as like this liberal beacon of progress, but it's, you know, at most center-right, at most. And it is time for a public reckoning and a divorce. Also because mainstream media is dead. The written media is so dead. Like, people don't get their news from papers anymore. This is why the New York Times is investing millions and millions and millions of dollars in video, because people are not reading anymore as much as they used to back in the day. So it's sad that over 1,000 newspapers were shut down in the country, and this one horrible one continues to persist. But it's good that at least this organization does not have such a monopoly on information anymore. That, think, for all its faults, social media and like the addiction to social media and wanting to be skinnier or more muscular or whatever. Think about what would happen if social media did not exist during the genocide in Gaza. If these citizen journalists did not have their own individualized, independent broadcasting services, think of where the truth would be today. So I think it is good that this rag is collapsing. And on the question of, wanting to be a journalist or what comes with threats to safety, honestly, I've never done anything about safety. I feel like, if I get attacked, I feel like it would be good for book sales. But, like Salman Rushdie got stabbed. Anyway, but no, I say that to say, it's, to me, I get so much bad press, and I get so much harassment all the time, but I feel like I just can't in good faith print out the harassment and show it to my dad, who has to listen to the sound of rockets. So I just tell myself, that there are ways to feel safe and supported in my community, to look at the ways in which I can be protected and focus always at the task at hand, and not make activism or organizing something about the individual, because it's not. These things that come, the threats to safety, the libel, the attacks, the bigotry, it's all, one element of the larger focal point, which is genocide, which is occupation, imperialism, capitalism, gender violence, so on and so forth. There's a really good quote that I think about all the time by Toni Morrison, where she says, "I'm gonna stay here in the margins and I'm gonna let the center find me." And I think this is what allows me to be okay with never getting the book review, or be okay with never having access to these mainstream spaces, because I found my people on the margins, and at some point we will be the majority. I mean, we are, but at some point we will be the mainstream. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank these three incredible panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much, Chase, Sabrina, Mohammed. Mohammed mentioned the campaign to boycott the New York Times opinion section and the what'd you say?
Yeah, I forgot. Yeah.
And the campaign to boycott the 92Y. I also want to invite everybody, speaking of pressuring our mayor, to email Mayor Mamdani tonight to tell him to veto the city council's buffer zone bill. So this is really important. All of us have to do this tonight, to tell him to reject this bill that criminalizes protests outside of houses of worship and educational institutions, okay? Which we know is just a cover for Zionist attacks on our movement. So let's all email him tonight. And in a moment, I'm gonna call up our last amazing speaker, and after she finishes, I'm gonna ask everybody to take your chair and to move them to where? Over there? We think? I think to this. I think to the racks. I'm going to use my discernment. Okay, so pick up your chair. So finally, I am so proud to welcome up one of our just beloved leaders, just like movement heart and hearth, who keeps us going. Oh, you all are leaving me? Okay, well, that's fine. No, you keep, yeah, they're going to go. Okay, so thank you. Thank you. Without further ado, please welcome Queen Jean, who is a proud Haitian storyteller and human rights activist. She is the founder of Black Trans Liberation, a Jose Munoz award-winning movement leader, and Obie award-winning costume designer. Her costume designs are currently on Broadway at Cats the Jellicle Ball. Please join me in welcoming Queen Jean.
Hello, hello, hello. Good evening. Hello. Thank you so much. I just want to, can we just give this incredible panelist an incredible huge round of applause? The knowledge, the wisdom, and the fearlessness of these heroes, it is so commendable. So I thank you all for sharing your brilliance with us tonight. And also, too, I think oftentimes we forget that in this movement, it can become tiresome, right? We can feel like we're moving in this movement alone, but we are not alone. Is anybody alone here? Is anybody afraid? Because there's no fear when we're fighting for freedom. Can we agree on that? And most importantly, we need these opportunities and these invitations for us to gather so that we can refuel each other. We can restore the battery pack and know that while this fight can be tumultuous, it could be aggravating, it could be enraging, because we know that there are systems in power, empires, institutions that are funded, overly funded, to keep us in the dark. And not only is that violent, what it does is it weakens and it neutralizes the community's response to show up for each other, to demand that we are not only going to demand an end to genocide, but we are also going to end racism in this country. We must. In 1964, one of our incredible leaders, Malcolm X, wrote, "If you are not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people being oppressed and loving those who are doing the oppressing." This was written 64 years ago. And to me, in 2026, I am reflecting about the legacy of injustice that we have had to inherit, the legacy of turmoil that we are left to hold. And ultimately, it is not for us to reckon with, it is them to reckon with. They should be the ones that are changing these systems. They should be the ones that are encouraging and making sure that everyone's livelihood is improved. But we know that we have to do that work. We have to recommit. And we also know that the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And it's because that they have the power to control the mind of the people and the masses as we were. So we know that that is not true because, honey, we, the people, are the power. And we also know that we can change this system. Can we not? For the past few years now, we have witnessed injustice that has been layered with the intentional misinformation machine. Journalism and deception should not share the same headline. But we know that we are fighting for the truth while we are dodging these blatant attacks on our humanity. As we have witnessed tonight from the documentary, Heightened Scrutiny, as well as so many of our offerings from our leaders tonight, that this is indeed a well-oiled, well-funded machine that is doing everything in its power to erode our democracy. And that democracy means that we have to fight even harder to sustain it and to protect it. Evil will continue to triumph if we remain silent. Will you remain silent? No. Will you remain silent? No. What will you do? I heard fight back. I heard resist. be loud. We must be loud because we cannot remain complicit while there are more wars that are erupting. We proudly here declare victory. We demand a free Palestine. Free Palestine! We declare victory for a free Congo. We declare victory for a free Sudan. We declare victory for a free Haiti. We declare victory for a free Lebanon, for free Iran. We declare victory for free Puerto Rico. We declare victory from our ancestors here on Turtle Island that are still being oppressed. Land acknowledgement is not enough. Land back. We unfortunately are in a moment where we recognize that these institutions, what they truly seek is dominion. They seek to have financial, political, and racial supremacy. Ooh, honey, how gross. They crave so much more bloodshed and hatred. And all the while, this is what it does. It consumes the consciousness of the people. The populace, we are so drowned in confusion. What is really happening? But subsequently, we know that they are neutralizing the people's response. And that is truly the tool, and that is the form of fascism. Fascism works, and it has worked in 1930. It has worked in 1960. It has worked in the 80s and the 90s epidemic. It is working in 2026, and we must do everything in our power to make fascism obsolete. The uniforms have changed, but the evil cruelness has continued, has it not? What we have witnessed and over the past couple years has truly grown into, to me, what I feel like is such a turbulent wave in this nation. Dana White reminds us that to be civil and professional with a fascist, it just makes you a fascist. Fascism looks like people being starved and persecuted while being labeled the threat. Fascism looks like millions of people remaining silent out of the threat of fear or lost opportunities. But can we think about the people that have lost their lives? The millions that are still sleeping and living in tents right now. Fascism even looks like candidates evading and blatantly ignoring the calls to end a systemic genocide and the war-funded terror that continues to plague millions all around this country. Fascism looks like targeted campaigns to dehumanize and to delegitimize the fearless voices of our leaders, educators, faith workers, international rapporteurs, and even international court proceedings. Fascism looks like dehumanizing local heroes who have proudly set sail to break the siege. We fight with them, and our collective efforts will not stop until the fascism stops. As we know recently, there have even been attacks on leaders, bomb threats. We know that the campus uprisings all around this entire nation, while more students were abducted, teachers and educators were fired, there was retaliation, and even students were then expelled because they said we will no longer remain complicit while our institution that we're paying for is funding genocide. That weapon manufacturers are still producing weaponry, bombs that are now harming an entire different populace of humans. What shame. We know that ICE supremacy is a targeted tool to destroy our people. They may not have hoods, they may not even have badges, but what they do have is an order to kill our families. And that in itself should awaken each and every single one of us. They have done it in daylight. They have abducted our people even at school. They've abducted children. They have done everything in their power to try to impose fear. But are you afraid? Are you afraid? All right. Fascism continues to look like our journalists, our valuable community members whose homes have been raided, whose entire lives and personal information and data have been doxxed, have been leaked, whose livelihood has been compromised for misinformation and lies. Fascism continues to look like the threat of a freedom of world where trans and queer and Muslim and Jewish and African and united people should and will continue to exist together. We have no fear that liberation is ours. The enemy cannot and will not eradicate our love for each other. And so tonight I am so honored that you have all recommitted to saying that we will come together. We will restore the brokenness that has been felt because we possess the power to heal. And even in these moments where we're seeing even more treacherous headlines, even more atrocious actions being done upon the people, we know that the people will always prevail because our power is ordained and it is divine and we were born free. I ask you all to look around this space and say, hey, neighbor. You can look to your left. Hello. I want us to all commit to our neighbors that we will fight for each other. I will fight for you. I will protect you. It is our duty to remain as the lighthouses in this community. We have to crack at every part of the systemic wall that is oppressing the people around us. We possess the power to actually create light that will indeed drown out all the darkness. I stand before you here tonight as a survivor, as a leader. I am black. I am queer. I am tall. I am an immigrant. I am a woman. And I will fight for my neighbor, and I will fight until there is no more oppression on this earth. Will you stand and fight with me? I really just want to urge all of us here before we leave this incredible sanctuary that it is in moments like this where we are just approaching a breakthrough. I want us all to recognize just in the last couple of days, what we have seen even for the last month or so, we have seen that the empire of the right, baby, the empire is breaking down. The people or the henchmen, they are now being fired. They're being removed. We've even seen Tucker Carlson. Is anybody into that? I'm not into it. But Tucker Carlson got on TV to say, I apologize. I have misled the American people. Did the New York Times report it? So I want us all to know that we cannot depend on an institution to get us free. We have never earned our freedom by relying on someone else in power to do it. The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Can we agree on that? So we know that the tools of oppression that have mislabeled us, called us degenerate, called us evil, called us activists, we are proudly activists, and we are proudly here to demand humanity for each and every single person under the sun. I feel a lightness in this space tonight. Because everyone here has said, I will do everything in my power, whether it's at your school, at your kids' school, at your office, at work, your place of worship. We have got to correct the injustices that have happened. We have got to re-inform people that what you may have read is not true. Transgender people are not the enemy. Palestinian people will never be the enemy. Black people are not the enemy. We know that it's in these moments that even with the misinformation, we know that cultures and religions have existed together and will continue to, because it is our duty and our right to gain our freedom. I thank you all for being here. So as we close out, I would just love for us to all sing together. Is that okay? All right. And so as I sing, you'll repeat after me. I've been marching every day. Until there's justice here to stay. I will not accept defeat. So we gonna be out in the street. I've been marching for my life. Marching for free Palestine. Rain, shine, or snow. Until the people take control. I've been marching for my life. Marching for human rights. Rain, shine, or snow. The ICE agents have to go. Rain, shine, or snow. Fascism's got to go. One day we'll be free. Our children will be free. Our sisters will be free. Our brothers will be free. Our siblings will be free. Free to just be. Free. I thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. The people will not only prevail, we will reclaim our power by any means necessary. And we will no longer have to live in fear. We will not be afraid of our neighbor because they look different from us. We will be encouraged to love them because indeed they are made and created in love. And so I ask that you all leave here in love, empowered, and knowing that your beauty deserves to shine, and that we will exist in paradise together.